What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And over at our shorts videos, we've talked about a few cards that aren't modern legal that I would absolutely love to see in the modern format. And from time to time, I post these kind of hypothetical videos where we kind of get into very surface level stuff, because obviously those videos are only a minute long, on some cards that I think are very powerful or they do very powerful things. And they don't really see that much play in the older formats of Magic, of course, because there's like roughly like 10,000 cards that are getting printed into those sets at any given time, every time that a set comes out. And I at least thought it was a really interesting kind of like hypothetical thought, experiment, whatever you want to call it. And I wanted to take this time to make a video, kind of compiling some of the cards that we've gone over so far and kind of fleshing out the reasons and, some of my, like pros and cons, I guess, of having those cards into the modern format. So I hope that you join me on this journey. All I ask is that if at any point you have your own kind of 2 cents you want to throw in for any card, or if there's a specific card that you would like to see featured in a video later on, be sure to leave that in the comments down below. And of course, leave a like on the video as well if you enjoy. Plus, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. You'll get notified whenever we post shorts or videos on the channel. We're trying to get up to, 4 or 5 shorts a week, 3 to 5 videos a week. We're going to be ramping up here as the summer kind of winds down and things get a little less crazy over on this end. And if you want even more content, be sure to check out the description down below. You can find a link to my Discord server, my Twitch channel, my second YouTube channel, the Casual Spikes Podcast YouTube channel. And then lastly, I want to thank the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders. Manatraders is a monthly subscription service that you can use to rent cards for Magic the Gathering online, so you can play in the various different tournaments and competitive leagues on Magic the Gathering online. I've been subscribed to Manatraders for over 5 years at this point. They have a lot of really cool rewards. The longer that you're subscribed, your price is going down, your rental limits increasing, so on. They have various different options for whether you're someone that doesn't want to invest too much time into playing or you want to go full grinder. They essentially have anything and everything, and they have you covered. And of course, again, I've been subscribed to them for over 5 years at this point. They've been immensely helpful in creating different content as well as playtesting for when I'm getting ready for like regional championships, RCQs, and those sort of things. And if you use my code in the description down below, you'll be able to get 5% off your monthly subscription, and you'll be helping out the channel as well. So it's a little bit of a win-win for everybody. So if you're interested, go ahead and check them out. Use my code if you do end up signing up. I do greatly appreciate it. And again, I want to thank Manatraders for being a sponsor of the channel. Now let's go ahead and get into our first card that I would like to see in the modern format. So the first card that we're going to look at, and the card that kind of inspired this, unexpected series, I guess, to kind of take place on the channel, is Goblin Lackey. Goblin Lackey is probably one of the most iconic goblins and is probably one of the best goblin cards of all time. So Goblin Lackey is 1 red mana for a 1/1. That whenever it deals damage to a player, you may put a goblin permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. Now, obviously, the power of Goblin Lackey, I'll kind of compare it to something like Ragavan. Even though it doesn't seem like Ragavan now is like super powerful, Ragavan is still a card that once it kind of gets going and it starts snowballing and it's giving you mana, of course, it's getting in for a little bit of damage. It's potentially giving you some cards off the top of your opponent's library. You're just getting so far ahead in the mana department where, yeah, of course, you're tapping your mana and you're, cracking your treasures to potentially play 3-4 mana spells on like turn 2 or turn 3. That's still a huge advantage for you, for the fact that, you're casting these cards, ahead of curve. And at least in the case of Ragavan, you're not necessarily having to kind of spend that mana at that time, which means that you kind of lose a little bit of value, I would say, in that way. But of course, you're casting something even bigger or potentially double spelling early on, and that ends up being a pretty big bonus for you if you're the player playing Ragavan. Goblin Lackey is essentially the same thing, except that you're not going to be able to necessarily double spell with it in the same way that you are with Ragavan, but rather you're just going to end up putting these giant mana costed goblins in play, something like Goblin Ringleader, where it can get you a little bit of card advantage, or something like Siege Gang Commander, which is going to put 4 bodies into play and add up a total of 5 power, which when you combine it with all the other various lords of the format, you end up being set into a pretty good spot here. On top of that too, this does leave your mana available, so you are able to, like on turn 2, after you put a Siege Gang into play, you're able to play your second land and potentially activate the Siege Gang Commander, killing at a creature your opponent controls, and kind of further snowballing with the Goblin Lackey, or just playing another 2-mana Goblin, whatever the case may be. Goblin Lackey just puts in an insane amount of work and is like a 1-mana card that could give you, 5, 10, 15 mana worth of like cards played off of it. Obviously the downside for it, at least in the modern format, it's super easy to block. Obviously in red you're gonna have to deal with like Lightning Bolt and the various different other removal spells that associate with the color red, but with it being a 1/1, 1 toughness creatures are incredibly hostile. I guess a lot of decks are just hostile to these like 1 toughness creatures, and you have to be very, very good, something like a Ragavan or an Ocelot Pride to see play. And I think Goblin Lackey kind of reaches that point, but it's a card that is hard to kind of get value for it when you play it while your opponent's tapped out. Like Ocelot Pride, you could at least get a 1/1 cat, or potentially more depending on how many permanents you have in play. Ragavan, you're able to dash and get in with haste, and while we do have Arena of Glory to give Goblin Lackey haste and potentially get in, which is kind of like a bonus to the Goblin Lackey, it's also not necessarily the most exciting thing, because you're wanting to play this on turn 1, so it doesn't really matter if it gets haste or not. You want to be attacking with it on turn 2, and you end up kind of time walking yourself a little bit by exerting your land on turn 2 without really another follow-up to follow it up with, unless you're able to kind of put in some massive goblins from like turn 2 onward. So with all the hostility towards 1 toughness creatures, all of the good 1 mana and 0 mana removal that exists in the format, on top of things like Wrath of the Skies being very good, that a lot of the time clear up the majority of the goblin permanents that you want to put into play and that you want to play with anyway. I think Goblin Lackey is a card that has a tremendous amount of upside if you're a person that wants to kind of play goblins in the modern format, with some checks already put in place that kind of handle the goblin decks, and they kind of get to do their thing where they could potentially just put a bunch of goblins into play if you're not really interacting with them, but then also has to play this weird kind of interactive game if your opponent is playing more of a fair strategy like black white or something like the Boros Energy deck. So I think Goblin Lackey would be a really interesting add to the modern format. I think, again, it is one of the most iconic goblins of all time, and probably one of the best goblins of all time, and certainly is one of the best goblin enablers of all time. Now, it just remains to be seen that if something like that can exist in the modern format, and if that would even make goblins necessarily good. I think goblins would still need a few more cards, but I think if you're someone that would want to play that style of deck in the modern format, it kind of starts with Goblin Lackey because of all the other really good goblins that we have in the modern format. And of course, if you want to join in the discussion, or if you want to talk about maybe your reasons for a lot of these cards that wouldn't be okay, or they would be okay from the modern format, or if you want to shout out some of your own cards, be sure to leave those in the comments down below. But that's all I got to say about Goblin Lackey. Let's go ahead and talk about another 1 mana creature that is basically on the complete opposite side of Goblin Lackey. Next up, we have Phyrexian Dreadnought, and I know it says part of the reserved list here, but I don't care. I'm living my own hypothetical world. Y'all just got to meet me there for just a little bit. I got to live here. Y'all can just visit. But Phyrexian Dreadnought is a 1 mana artifact creature, Phyrexian Dreadnought. It is a 12/12 trampler, but you have to sacrifice any number of creatures with total power 12 or greater, or you have to sacrifice the Phyrexian Dreadnought. Now, there's a decent amount of things going on with Phyrexian Dreadnought, and really what makes Phyrexian Dreadnought really good in the older formats is the fact that it is an incredibly cheap creature that has an ability that is able to be stifled. So, Stifle is a card that will counter an activated or triggered ability when Phyrexian Dreadnought enters the battlefield. That ability to sacrifice a bunch of things or sacrifice the Dreadnought ends up triggering. And with cards like Consign to Memory that exist, we have a way that not only we can stifle it, but if we think that our opponent is going to try to counter our stifle to get rid of our Phyrexian Dreadnought, we are able to replicate it to make sure that we counter our own triggered ability to get our 12/12 into play. This style of strategy is also not necessarily, if I resolve this, I win the game. Simply for the fact that if your opponent ends up having something like Fatal Push or Prismatic Ending, or like a Wrath of the Skies for 3 or for 1, if they have something like Solitude, whatever, all of these things are for, again, super cheap, efficient answers, kind of like the same way with the Goblin Lackey, even though there's less things because Phyrexian Dreadnought has roughly 11 more toughness than our Goblin friend. This is a card that, does have a lot of answers for it, but it's also a card that if you don't have any answers right away for it, it can close out a game very quickly. A 12 power thing, I don't care how many creatures you end up throwing in front of it, you are trading so many cards to get rid of this Phyrexian Dreadnought if you're trying to do it in a fair way. But again, if you have like any of the aforementioned removal spells, your opponent essentially has to 2-for-1 themselves to kind of get the Phyrexian Dreadnought thing to even work. Another card that's kind of interesting with this that I think also is like a one-up layer of ideally not getting 2-for-1 by your opponent is something like Dress Down. Now, it's a card that when Urza Saga is really good, it's a card that ends up seeing a little bit more play for the fact that it ends up getting rid of the construct tokens that are made by Urza Saga, but you could play it on the end step on your opponent's turn and then untap with it and play your third land, play a Phyrexian Dreadnought or potentially multiple Dreadnoughts, while also getting to leave up some form of interaction for your opponent's removal spells, or, just even playing multiple Dreadnoughts makes it incredibly harder unless your opponent is playing something like Wrath of the Skies or any kind of other Wrath to end up dealing with a Phyrexian Dreadnought. This is just I wouldn't say necessarily a really powerful strategy, but it is a strategy that, if you kind of get paid off and rewarded for it, you can end the game in roughly 2 turns, which even with like Arena of Glory things, which may be where we start to incur some problems where you're able to, give a Phyrexian Dreadnought or multiple Phyrexian Dreadnoughts haste and then stifle their ETBs and then just kill your opponent in 1 turn. Obviously, that's going to be a lot of mana and, again, forces your opponent not to have any interaction at all whatsoever. Considering right now in the format, even though something like Boros Energy would probably have a really hard time dealing with a Phyrexian Dreadnought, especially if you're able to give it haste and smack them with it right away. There are plenty of other decks that exist in the Modern format that have a way of either bouncing the Phyrexian Dreadnought, still having to use a card to keep it around on the battlefield anyway, or just have ways to completely remove a Phyrexian Dreadnought from play, whether exiling it or just outright killing it. And yeah, even though this is part of the reserve list, and of course it's never getting reprinted, I will say, never say never, because we could end up getting this in a gold border, and then maybe gold border cards or like these proxy cards that we'd seen from like the 30th anniversary end up being legal, and we'll end up getting a Phyrexian Dreadnought. Also, someone tell me if they actually did print Phyrexian Dreadnought in there. I don't think they did. But, if you do know, let me know in the comments down below. I think that this would just be a really interesting strategy. And, this is something that's like really good too in the pre-modern format, which I absolutely love. And if you guys want to see any pre-modern stuff or discussion on pre-modern, let me know, because I would absolutely love to feel a little bit more justified into diving, headfirst into that format. But, that's kind of my thoughts on Phyrexian Dreadnought. Let's go ahead and move on to our last card, which I think of the 3 would have the most likelihood of being printed in the Modern format, and I think is actually a card that is very skill intensive and requires, it's a card that is good, but it's good in like the right player's hands, and it's not just good, in general when any player plays it. So let's go ahead and check out our last card. So last but not least, we have Cabal Therapy, a 1-mana sorcery that says choose a non-land card name. Target player reveals their hand and discards all cards with that name. Flashback, sacrifice a creature. Now, this card would see a ton of play in decks that were playing like Young Pyromancer, or we even saw like Sedgemoor Witch from like Strixhaven, where you could play the Cabal Therapy and you end up getting a creature token, so that when you Cabal Therapy your opponent, if you ended up missing, well, then you'd have a creature to sacrifice for the flashback cost. You would get the card out of your opponent's hand, and you would technically still have a 1/1 around. You would end up making it after you cast the Cabal Therapy again. In something like Legacy, this has been a card that, is either really good or really bad, depending on who you are, and it finds its way into multiple different styles of decks. Obviously, in mid-range, you could just use this to name a potential combo piece from your opponent and end up getting it or multiple copies out of your opponent's hand, with the ability to play it later on if it ends up being beneficial for you to sacrifice one of your creatures, because that does kind of reduce your clock, to then get another combo piece or a threat out of your opponent's hand. You could could also do this for like the combo decks where you're looking for something like Force of Will in Legacy, Force of Negation, Daze, whatever the case may be, whatever interaction for your combo, you can end up playing Cabal Therapy. And again, it's sitting there in your graveyard with the potential to flash it back on the turn that maybe you're going to go off to make sure that the coast is clear. And really with Cabal Therapy too, this card gets better the better your format knowledge is and how much better you are as a player. Anybody could obviously play Cabal Therapy in, Legacy, Vintage, whatever. The hard thing about playing Cabal Therapy is playing it and making sure that you're naming the right things at the right time. You can even, if you're good at like getting a read on your opponent, you're able to kind of, think like, okay, well, they're playing in a way where they're going to want to dash Ragavan and do a thing, so I can't really deal with the Ragavan, so I'm going to be able to cast Cabal Therapy and hit Ragavan and, have the potential to hit another card out of your hand with the flashback on Cabal Therapy. And that's really where the card is super powerful. If you're a player that kind of understands the strategy of what your opponent's trying to do, if you have a very good understanding of the format, you're able to hit at least 2, if not more cards with Cabal Therapy, with, casting it normally and then of course flashing it back, and that just gives you so much advantage over your opponent, getting 2-3 cards out of their hand for 1 card and maybe a creature. And of course in a lot of the other decks you're not really losing out on the creature. It ends up being probably one of the best cards, and that could potentially be the sticking point for Cabal Therapy not really being printed into the modern format, is kind of like that, again, like combo players are able to play this to make sure that the coast is clear. The mid-range decks can just kind of, use this as a way to get some kind of card advantage. Again, a little bit harder doing it that way because you need to have a lot of format knowledge and understand like how your opponent's playing, and it's never guaranteed to hit a card on the first time you play it, but it's almost always guaranteed on the flashback as long as you kind of play it within like a turn or 2, I would say, obviously deck depending, but if you play it a turn or 2 after you've played it the first time, you're going to be able to get something. And it's a super skill intensive card. I think it's a card that maybe is held back in that way, but then has so much potential. It's like Brainstorm in Legacy where, there's a good chance that as a player, you're just not playing it right. And there's so many different ways and so many different situations where you want to play a Brainstorm, but like you don't want to play it, typically here because in this scenario, whatever, and Cabal Therapy kind of falls into that same vein, albeit, the decisions I think are a little bit easier than Brainstorm, but most things are a lot easier than trying to correctly resolve a Brainstorm, which is a headache in its own right. But, that's me, and those are the 3 cards that I would like to see personally in the modern format. Now, I know for Exchange Dreadnought, we'll probably never, ever, ever, ever see any sort of play or existence in the modern format for being on the reserve list. But I think these other 2 cards are pretty powerful. I think that they offer something pretty unique to the format that, again, like one of them being pretty skill intensive, the other one just allowing that deck to kind of have some really broken and busted draws that, can kind of keep up with the fast-paced modern metagame. But again, let me know in the comments down below what you think of any of these cards, if there's something that maybe you want to add or something that you want to push back on, anything. I do greatly appreciate those comments, maybe even shouting out some other cards that you would like to see in the modern format and why. I would greatly appreciate all that stuff. And if you made it to the end of the video, make sure you leave a like on the video and of course subscribe to the channel so you can see more videos. I want to do some more of these discussion type videos, and again, with kind of the summer winding down, hopefully things are going to be a little less crazy and we're able to pump out a few more videos a week than we have been here lately. So definitely be on the lookout for that. Of course, again, subscribe to the channel. Thank you all for watching. I do greatly appreciate it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.